What lies hidden at the bottom of a lake for 6 years can hold the key to 2 disappearances that haunted an entire state. Picture this. September 2012. 2 young people vanish into thin air from the same remote wilderness area. On the same weekend, under circumstances so baffling that investigators found themselves chasing ghosts. For 6 years, the silent, majestic peaks of the Uinta-Wasatch-Cache National Forest guarded a dark secret. A secret that would only be revealed by a fisherman's chance discovery. A waterlogged yellow sleeping bag, and a sinister connection buried deep in the digital world. This is the story of how a cold case, frozen in time and forgotten by all but those who loved the missing, exploded back to life. It's a story of how modern technology finally caught up with old evil, how a single motel cleaner's courage broke through years of silence, and how an arrest shocked a community that thought they knew their neighbors. 2 disappearances, 1 sleeping bag, and a criminal who thought the wilderness would keep his secrets forever. He was wrong. Let me introduce you to Asha, 23 years old, with a spirit that couldn't be contained by city walls or office cubicles. Those who knew her described her as fearless but never reckless, adventurous but always prepared. Asha wasn't just someone who enjoyed hiking. She lived for it. The mountains were her church, the trails her meditation, the summit her reward. Growing up in Salt Lake City, Asha had spent her childhood exploring the Wasatch Range with her father, a ranger who taught her everything about wilderness survival. By the time she was a teenager, she could read a topographic map like most kids read comic books. She knew how to purify water, build a shelter, navigate by the stars. Her friends joked that Asha could probably survive a zombie apocalypse armed with nothing but a Swiss Army knife and a good pair of boots. But Asha was more than just an outdoors enthusiast. She worked as a veterinary technician at a clinic in Holiday, where her colleagues remember her gentle touch with frightened animals and her quick thinking in emergencies. She volunteered at the local animal shelter every other weekend. She loved indie folk music, brewed her own kombucha, and had a laugh that one friend described as infectious, the kind that made everyone around her start laughing too, even if they didn't know it was funny. Asha had dreams, big ones. She was saving money to attend veterinary school, planning to specialize in wildlife medicine. She wanted to work in national parks, treating injured wild animals, combining her 2 greatest passions. Her apartment was filled with field guides, hiking maps marked with past and future adventures, and photos of mountain peaks she'd conquered. In September 2012, Asha planned a solo backpacking trip into the Uinta-Wasatch-Cache National Forest. It wasn't unusual for her. She'd done dozens of solo trips before, each one carefully planned and executed. This particular journey was meant to be a 4-day trek through some of the most remote and beautiful terrain in Utah. A chance to decompress from a stressful few weeks at work, to reconnect with herself, to find that clarity that only comes from sleeping under a canopy of stars. But Asha wasn't careless. She knew the risks of solo hiking, and she took precautions that would make any ranger proud. She filed a detailed trip plan with her best friend, Kayla, including her intended route, campsite locations, and expected return date. She packed emergency supplies, a satellite phone for emergencies, and enough food for 6 days, 2 extra days worth, just in case. Most importantly, Asha had a check-in system. Every 72 hours, without fail, she would text her family to let them know she was safe. It was a promise she'd made to her mother years ago, after her mom had spent one too many sleepless nights worrying. And Asha never broke that promise. Not once in 5 years of regular solo hiking. Until September 2012. The last person to see Asha alive was a convenience store clerk near the trailhead. He remembered her clearly because she bought 3 chocolate bars and joked that they were emergency morale boosters for when the trail got tough. He said she seemed excited, energetic, ready for her adventure. She filled up her water bottles, adjusted her pack, and headed toward the trailhead parking area. That was the last confirmed sighting of Asha alive. Now let me tell you about Milo Roddick. 24 years old, from Tempe, Arizona. On the surface, Milo seemed like he had it all together. He'd graduated from Arizona State University with a degree in business management, worked for a logistics company, and lived in a decent apartment complex with a roommate. His social media showed a young man who enjoyed hiking, mountain biking, and craft beer. Pretty standard stuff for a millennial living in the Southwest. But Milo had secrets. Financial troubles his family didn't know about. Poor decisions that had led him down a path he desperately wanted to escape. And connections to people whose business dealings operated firmly in the shadows. What investigators would later discover is that Milo was active in the same online hiking communities as Asha. They'd never met in person, at least, there's no evidence they had before September 2012, but they'd exchanged messages on hiking forums, shared trail recommendations, even commented on each other's trip reports. In the digital age, this kind of connection wasn't unusual. Hiking enthusiasts formed tight-knit online communities, supporting each other's adventures from afar. Milo told his roommate he was driving up to Utah for a weekend hiking trip. He said he needed to clear his head, that he had some thinking to do about his future. His roommate thought nothing of it. Milo often took spontaneous trips, but this trip wasn't spontaneous. And Milo wasn't just going hiking. He was about to make a decision that would cost him his life. September 15, 2012. Asha sent her first check-in text to her mother. Day 1 complete. Amazing views. Weather perfect. Love you. Her mother, Linda, texted back with heart emojis and a reminder to stay hydrated. September 18th. Right on schedule. Another text. Day 4. Found the most incredible alpine lake. Saw a moose this morning. All good. Talk soon. Linda responded with excitement, asking for photos when Asha got back. Then came September 21st, the day of the scheduled third check-in. Nothing. Linda tried not to panic. Maybe Asha's phone died. Maybe she was in a dead zone without signal. Maybe she'd just gotten distracted and would text later that evening. But as the hours crawled by and her messages went unanswered, a cold dread settled into Linda's chest. By midnight, she'd called Asha's phone 17 times. Straight to voicemail every time. September 22nd, at 6 in the morning, Linda called the Summit County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. The dispatcher took down the information, and by 9 o'clock that morning, a search and rescue operation was underway. The SAR team arrived at the trailhead where Asha's car was parked, exactly where she'd said it would be. Her silver Honda Civic sat alone in the small dirt lot, covered in a light layer of dust. When deputies looked inside, everything seemed normal. No signs of a struggle. No broken glass. The car was locked. Search and rescue coordinator Tom Brennan, a 20-year veteran who'd led hundreds of wilderness searches, assembled his team. They had Asha's detailed trip plan, which gave them a significant advantage. They knew her intended route, her planned campsites, the trails she'd said she would take. The search began immediately. Dozens of volunteers, along with professional SAR teams, combed the wilderness. They followed the trail Asha had outlined, checking every campsite, every turnoff, every overlook. They called her name until their voices went hoarse. They looked for any sign, a discarded wrapper, a footprint, a piece of torn fabric on a branch. They found nothing. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras swept the area, looking for heat signatures. Trained search dogs followed scent trails but kept losing them at odd points along the trail, as if Asha had simply evaporated into thin air. By the 4th day of searching, Tom Brennan was deeply troubled. In his 2 decades of experience, he'd seen hikers get lost, injured, even killed by wildlife or weather. But there were always signs, always some indication of what had happened. This case had none of that. It's like she vanished, he told reporters during a press conference. An experienced hiker with proper gear, good weather conditions, a well-marked trail, and absolutely no trace. In my career, I've never seen anything quite like this. The search continued for 2 weeks. Volunteers from hiking clubs across Utah showed up to help. Asha's family distributed flyers with her photo, that bright, infectious smile, asking anyone with information to come forward. Local news stations ran stories about the missing hiker. The online hiking communities where Asha was active rallied together, sharing information, theorizing, hoping. But hope began to fade when the first snow of autumn dusted the high peaks. The search area was massive, hundreds of square miles of rugged wilderness. Without any clues about what direction Asha might have gone or what might have happened to her, the search teams were essentially looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a small state. The official search was called off after 3 weeks. It was one of the most comprehensive searches in Utah's history, and it had turned up exactly 0 evidence. Detective Sarah Chun of the Summit County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation from that point. Unlike search and rescue, which assumes the person is lost and alive, Detective Chun had to consider other possibilities. Had Asha deliberately disappeared? Was there foul play? Did she have enemies? Financial troubles? A secret boyfriend who might have done her harm? The answers to all these questions were no, 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 and no. Asha's bank accounts showed normal activity right up until her disappearance. Then nothing. Her social media accounts went silent. Her friends and family were interviewed extensively. Everyone agreed that Asha was happy, stable, excited about her future. She had no reason to vanish voluntarily, and she wasn't the type to fake her own disappearance for attention. Detective Chun examined Asha's phone records. The last ping from her cell phone came from a tower near the trailhead area on September 15th, consistent with her first check-in. After that, nothing. Either her phone died, was turned off, or was destroyed. The investigation hit wall after wall. No body, no evidence of foul play, no witnesses who'd seen anything unusual. Just a young woman who walked into the forest and never walked out. Meanwhile, in Tempe, Arizona, another family was going through their own nightmare. Milo Roddick's roommate, Jake, reported him missing on September 24, 2012. Milo had left for his Utah hiking trip on September 14th and said he'd be back by the 21st. When he didn't return and didn't answer his phone, Jake assumed Milo had extended his trip. But by the 24th, with still no word, Jake grew concerned and filed a missing person report. The Tempe Police Department ran a standard missing person investigation. They tracked Milo's credit card. The last charge was for gas in Provo, Utah, on September 14th. After that, no financial activity whatsoever. His phone, like Asha's, went dark. But here's where things get interesting, though no one realized it at the time. Milo's car was never found. Unlike Asha, whose vehicle was discovered at the trailhead, Milo's blue Ford Explorer simply vanished along with him. Arizona police issued a bolo, "Be on the lookout" for the vehicle, but it never turned up. Not in Utah, not in Arizona, not anywhere. The two cases, Asha's disappearance in Utah and Milo's disappearance in Arizona, existed in completely separate investigative universes. Different states, different agencies, different missing person databases. The fact that both individuals had vanished during the same weekend in September 2012 from the same general wilderness area went completely unnoticed. There was no reason to connect them. They lived in different states. They had no known mutual friends. On paper, they were just two young people who loved hiking and had the terrible misfortune to go missing around the same time. This would be the critical mistake that allowed a killer to evade justice for 6 years. Detective Sarah Chun refused to let Asha's case fade into obscurity, even as the months stretched into years without any breaks. She kept the file on her desk, reviewing it periodically, hoping some new piece of information would shake loose. She re-interviewed Asha's friends, family, and co-workers multiple times. She examined every aspect of Asha's life, looking for something, anything, that might explain what happened. She went through Asha's laptop, her email accounts, her social media profiles, her online forum activity. And that's where Detective Chun found something interesting. Asha had been active on several hiking forums, particularly one called Trail Seekers, a niche community dedicated to solo hiking and backcountry adventure. Chun wasn't a hiker herself, so she didn't immediately understand the significance of this digital community. But as she dug deeper, she realized that Trail Seekers was more than just a message board. It was a tight-knit group where members shared detailed trip reports, asked for advice, and even arranged meetups on the trail. Detective Chun created her own account and started reading through years of Asha's posts. The young woman had been a prolific contributor, sharing beautiful photos of her adventures, offering advice to novice hikers, warning others about dangerous trail conditions. She had dozens of online friends, people she'd never met in person but who felt like kindred spirits. Chun made note of everyone Asha had regularly interacted with, creating a spreadsheet of usernames and real names when she could determine them. It was tedious work, but Chun had a theory. If something bad had happened to Asha, maybe it originated from this online community. Maybe someone she'd been talking to had darker intentions than just sharing trail recommendations. She reached out to several of Asha's online contacts, conducting phone interviews. Everyone expressed shock and sadness about Asha's disappearance. Many had followed the search efforts. None had any information about what might have happened to her. One username kept appearing in Asha's message history. Trailblazer_24. This person had exchanged messages with Asha fairly regularly in the months before her disappearance. Their conversations were typical forum stuff, discussing gear, debating the best lightweight tents, sharing favorite trails. Detective Chun tried to identify Trailblazer_24, but the account had gone dormant in September 2012. The last post was on September 13th, 2 days before Asha's trip. The user had written, "Heading out for a big adventure this weekend. Utah or bust. If I don't post for a while, assume I've been eaten by a bear. LOL." Chun noted this but didn't know what to make of it. Forum members often went weeks or months without posting, especially if they were busy with real life or taking extended trips. A dormant account wasn't necessarily suspicious. She tried to trace the account's registration information, but it led nowhere. The email address used to create the account was from a temporary email service that didn't keep logs. The username had no identifying information. Without a subpoena for the forum's IP logs, and without probable cause to get such a subpoena, Chun couldn't identify who was behind Trailblazer_24. The investigation stalled there. Meanwhile, the case of Milo Roddick in Arizona was equally cold. Detective James Morrison of the Tempe Police Department had exhausted every lead. Milo's family couldn't shed any light on where he might have gone or why he hadn't come back. His roommate had no idea what might have happened. His employer said Milo had been a reliable employee, though he'd seemed stressed in the weeks before he disappeared. Detective Morrison did learn something interesting from Milo's employer, though. The logistics company Milo worked for had recently conducted an internal audit and discovered some irregularities in their shipping manifests. Nothing major. A few packages that showed as delivered but whose recipients claimed they'd never received them. Milo had been the driver on those routes. The company hadn't pressed charges. The dollar amount was small, and they had no direct evidence Milo was involved. But Morrison noted it in his file. Was Milo involved in something shady? Had he stolen packages and sold the contents? Had he gotten mixed up with the wrong people? Morrison tried to dig deeper, but without Milo's financial records, which required a court order, he couldn't determine if the missing hiker had been involved in any criminal activity. And a judge wasn't going to issue a warrant to investigate a missing person's finances without evidence of a crime. The case went cold. Both Detective Chun in Utah and Detective Morrison in Arizona did what investigators do with cold cases. They moved on to active cases that had better chances of being solved. Asha's file and Milo's file were boxed up, stored in evidence rooms, waiting for that one break that might never come. Asha's family, devastated by the lack of answers, held a memorial service in December 2012. Without a body, they couldn't have a funeral, but they needed some kind of closure, some way to honor their daughter's memory. Friends and family gathered at Asha's favorite hiking spot, a scenic overlook in the Wasatch Mountains, and shared stories about her infectious laugh, her love of animals, her adventurous spirit. Her mother, Linda, spoke through tears. "We don't know what happened to our beautiful girl. We may never know, but I want everyone to remember Asha as she lived, fearlessly, joyfully, with love in her heart for every living creature. That's the Asha we'll carry with us forever." The local hiking community installed a memorial plaque at the trailhead where Asha's car had been found. It read, "In memory of Asha, may the mountains you loved keep you in eternal peace." Milo's family in Arizona held a similar service. They too had no body, no answers, only questions that echoed into the void. His mother created a Facebook page called Find Milo Roddick, hoping that keeping his story alive might eventually lead to information about what happened to her son. But as the years passed, the Facebook page received fewer and fewer visitors. The posts became less frequent. The world moved on, as the world always does. Only the families remained frozen in that moment when their loved ones walked away and never came back. Detective Chun, however, never quite let go. Every few months, she'd pull out Asha's file and review it, hoping fresh eyes would spot something she'd missed. She attended conferences on cold case investigations, learning new techniques and technologies. She kept hoping that someday, somehow, science or luck or divine intervention would give her the break she needed. She kept a photo of Asha on her desk, that bright, infectious smile staring back at her, a reminder of the promise she'd made to Linda. "I will never stop looking for answers about what happened to your daughter." It was a promise that would take 6 years to fulfill. But when it finally came together, the truth would be more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The years between 2012 and 2018 were a special kind of torture for the families of the missing. Not the acute pain of fresh loss, but the dull, constant ache of unresolved grief. The kind that never scabs over because there's no body to bury, no definitive moment when hope officially dies. Linda, Asha's mother, kept her daughter's room exactly as she'd left it. The hiking boots by the door, the field guides stacked on the nightstand, the photos of mountain peaks pinned to a cork board. Friends gently suggested it might be time to pack things up, to create some emotional distance, but Linda couldn't bring herself to do it. "What if she comes back?" she'd say, even though she knew, deep down, that after this much time, Asha wasn't coming home. Not alive, anyway. Linda became active in missing persons advocacy. She attended support groups for families of the missing and disappeared. She learned that there were thousands of families just like hers, people who existed in this terrible limbo between hope and despair, between the person they loved being alive and being dead. She started a blog called Waiting for Asha, where she wrote about her experiences, her grief, her refusal to give up hope. The blog attracted a small but dedicated following, other families dealing with similar situations, true crime enthusiasts who were moved by Asha's story, hikers who felt a connection to the missing young woman who'd loved the wilderness so much. Every year on Asha's birthday, Linda organized a hike in her daughter's honor. Dozens of people would show up, many who'd never even met Asha, to walk the trails she'd loved and to keep her memory alive. They'd share stories, post photos online with the hashtag #FindAsha, and hope that maybe, somehow, the renewed attention would shake loose some piece of information. In Arizona, Milo's mother, Elena, went through a similar journey. She never gave up on finding out what happened to her son. She worked with missing persons organizations, kept his case active on social media, and periodically called Detective Morrison to ask if there were any updates. There never were. Elena had complicated feelings about Milo's disappearance. In the months after he vanished, she'd learned things about her son that she hadn't known. The financial troubles, the suspicious activity at his job, the possibility that he'd been involved in something illegal. She didn't know what to make of it. Had Milo gotten mixed up with dangerous people? Had he been running from something? Or was it all just coincidence, and her son had simply been the victim of a hiking accident that would never be discovered? She wrestled with these questions every single day. Detective Chun, meanwhile, continued working active cases, but Asha's file was never far from her mind. She'd developed a habit of pulling it out whenever she had a slow afternoon, reviewing the evidence, rereading witness statements, hoping something would click. In 2015, she attended a multi-state cold case conference in Denver. Law enforcement officers from across the western United States gathered to share information about unsolved cases, looking for patterns or connections that might have been missed when investigators were working in isolated silos. At the conference, Chun presented Asha's case to a room full of detectives. She showed photos, outlined the investigation, described the dead ends. She asked if anyone had worked similar cases, experienced hikers vanishing without a trace from well-traveled areas. A few hands went up. A detective from Colorado mentioned a case from 2010. Another from Montana talked about a disappearance in 2014. But nothing seemed to connect to Asha's situation in a meaningful way. Detective Morrison from Arizona wasn't at the conference. If he'd heard Chen's presentation, he might have made the connection to Milo Roddick's disappearance. But Morrison had retired in 2014, and Milo's case had been inherited by a new detective who had dozens of other active investigations demanding her attention. This is one of the great challenges of cold case investigation. Information silos. Even in the age of digital databases and multi-state information sharing, cases can slip through the cracks simply because the right people never talk to each other at the right time. Asha's case and Milo's case remained separate, unconnected, unsolved. But while the investigations languished, the killer was living his life. Dante Voss, 47 years old in 2012, with a criminal record dating back to his 20s. Assault, drug trafficking, extortion. He'd served time in Arizona State Prison twice and had been released in 2009. By 2012, he was operating what law enforcement calls a transportation network, a polite term for running illegal goods across state lines using unwitting couriers. The scheme was clever. Voss would recruit young people, usually those with financial troubles or spotty employment histories, to drive packages from one location to another. He'd pay them cash, good money for what seemed like simple delivery work. Most of his couriers had no idea they were transporting drugs, stolen goods, or other contraband. Plausible deniability was built into the system. If a courier got caught, they'd take the fall, not Voss. And if a courier started asking too many questions or threatened to go to the police, well, Voss had ways of dealing with that too. Milo Roddick had been one of Voss's couriers. He'd gotten involved in the summer of 2012, desperate for money to pay off credit card debt. At first, it seemed like easy cash. Drive a package from Phoenix to Salt Lake City, drop it at a predetermined location, drive home, get paid $500. No questions asked. But Milo wasn't stupid. He figured out pretty quickly that whatever he was transporting wasn't legal, and it ate at him. He was a fundamentally decent person who'd made a bad decision and didn't know how to get out of it. By September 2012, Milo had decided he was done. He was going to tell Voss he was out, that he wouldn't do any more runs. He knew this conversation would be risky. You don't just quit working for someone like Dante Voss. But Milo had reached his breaking point. He reached out to Asha through the Trail Seekers forum. They'd been online friends for months, and Milo trusted her, even though they'd never met in person. He sent her a private message, asking if she'd be willing to meet him in Utah. He said he was dealing with some serious personal issues and needed someone to talk to, someone outside his regular life who might offer perspective. Asha, kind-hearted and always willing to help a friend, agreed to meet him. They arranged to connect at a specific trailhead in the Uinta-Wasatch-Cache National Forest on September 16th. She adjusted her hiking itinerary to accommodate the meeting. It seemed like a harmless favor to a friend in need. What neither of them knew was that Voss had been monitoring Milo's communications. He'd given his couriers phones that he'd secretly installed spyware on, a basic security measure to make sure none of them were talking to the police or planning to betray him. When Voss saw Milo's messages to Asha, he grew suspicious. Who was this woman? Was Milo planning to talk to her about the courier work? Was he thinking about going to the authorities? Voss couldn't take that chance. He decided to handle the situation personally. This is the theory that investigators would eventually piece together. Voss followed Milo to Utah. He confronted him at the prearranged meeting spot before Asha arrived, or perhaps he caught them together. Exactly what happened in those moments will probably never be fully known, but the outcome was clear. Milo ended up dead, and Asha ended up a victim. For 6 years, Voss lived free, thinking he'd gotten away with murder. He continued his criminal enterprise, cycling through new couriers, always careful, always paranoid, always one step ahead of law enforcement. He had no idea that the wilderness he'd used to dispose of the evidence would eventually betray him. No idea that a fisherman's casual afternoon on a quiet lake would unravel everything. No idea that the bones lying at the bottom of Silus Lake were ticking like a time bomb, waiting to explode his carefully constructed lie. The cold case years were ending. The breakthrough was coming, and nothing would ever be the same. June 14, 2018. A warm summer afternoon. The kind of perfect weather that draws people to the mountains, away from the heat of the valleys below. Mark Stevens, a 62-year-old retiree from Kamas, Utah, decided to spend the day fishing at Silus Lake, a remote alpine lake tucked into the high country of the Uinta-Wasatch-Cache National Forest. Mark had been coming to this lake for 40 years. He knew every rock, every inlet, every spot where the fish liked to hide. He parked his truck at the trailhead, loaded his gear into his backpack, and hiked the 2 miles to the lake. The trail was quiet. He didn't pass another soul. That was one of the things Mark loved about Silus Lake. Even in summer, it was remote enough that you could have the place to yourself. He set up his folding chair at his favorite spot on the eastern shore, assembled his fishing rod, and cast his line into the clear, cold water. The afternoon stretched ahead of him, peaceful and perfect. Around 3 o'clock, Mark noticed his line snagging on something. At first, he thought it was a submerged log or a rock he hadn't remembered being there. He tugged, trying to free the hook, but whatever he'd snagged was heavy and stuck fast. Mark reeled in his line and moved to a different spot, casting again. But his curiosity was piqued. What was down there? He'd fished this exact area dozens of times and never had this problem before. He waded into the shallows, the icy water soaking his hiking boots, and peered down into the murky depths. The lake was crystal clear in some spots, but here, silt from the bottom clouded the water. He could just barely make out a shape, something yellow, something that didn't belong. Mark returned to shore, grabbed his hiking pole, and went back to the spot. He extended the pole down into the water, probing the bottom until he felt resistance. He hooked the end of the pole around whatever was down there and pulled. Took significant effort, but eventually, the object came loose and rose toward the surface. As it emerged from the water, Mark's stomach dropped. It was a sleeping bag, bright yellow, waterlogged, covered in algae and lake muck, and it was tied shut with rope. Mark had lived in Utah his entire life. He'd heard stories. He knew that sometimes terrible things got hidden in remote places, and a sleeping bag tied shut, at the bottom of a lake that most people never visited, could only mean one thing. He didn't open it. He didn't touch it more than necessary. He pulled it onto the shore, far enough that the current wouldn't take it back, and then he hiked the 2 miles back to his truck as fast as his 62-year-old legs would carry him. He had cell service when he reached the parking area. He called 911. "I think I found a body," he told the dispatcher. His voice was shaking. "In a sleeping bag. At Silus Lake. You need to send someone right away." The Summit County Sheriff's Office dispatched deputies immediately. Because of the remote location, it took several hours for law enforcement to reach the scene. By the time they arrived, evening was approaching, and they had to set up portable lights to properly investigate. Detective Sarah Chen got the call at 6:30 in the evening. She was at home, just sitting down to dinner with her husband, when her phone rang. "We've got a body recovery at Silus Lake," her lieutenant told her. "Remote location. Remains in a sleeping bag. Could be a homicide, could be a suicide, could be an old drowning. We need you up there." Chun felt a jolt of electricity run through her. Silus Lake. That was in the same general area where Asha had vanished 6 years ago. Could this be connected? She told her husband dinner would have to wait, grabbed her field kit, and headed into the mountains. By the time Chin arrived at the lake, it was nearly dark. Portable floodlights illuminated the shoreline where the yellow sleeping bag lay like a chrysalis that had hatched something terrible. The county medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, was already on scene, carefully documenting everything before moving the remains. "What do we have?" Chun asked, pulling on latex gloves. Dr. Hernandez looked up, her expression grim. "Skeletal remains. Male based on pelvic structure. Young adult, I'd estimate early 20s. The body's been submerged for years, judging by the condition of the sleeping bag and the complete skeletonization." Chun felt her pulse quicken. "Years. At least 3, possibly more. I'll be able to narrow it down more once I get the remains back to the lab." Chun crouched next to the sleeping bag, examining it closely with her flashlight. It was a high-quality camping sleeping bag, the kind serious backpackers used. The yellow color had faded from sun exposure before it ended up in the lake, but it was still identifiable. There were dark stains on the exterior, stains that Chun suspected were blood. The sleeping bag was tied shut, Dr. Hernandez said, pointing to the rope. Whoever put the body in here didn't want it floating up accidentally. They weighted it somehow, probably with rocks that fell out during the recovery. Chun photographed everything from every angle. This wasn't just a body dump. This was a crime scene that had been preserved underwater for years. Every detail mattered. Can we get any identifying information? Chun asked. Dental records? DNA? Absolutely, Dr. Hernandez said. The cold water actually preserved the remains better than if they'd been buried on land. I'll run dental comparison and DNA analysis as soon as we get back to the lab. As Dr. Hernandez and her team carefully removed the remains from the sleeping bag, Chun continued examining the bag itself. There was a tag near the zipper, partially deteriorated but still readable. A brand name, Mountain Summit Series, and below that, written in faded permanent marker, a name. Chen's heart stopped. The name was Asha. Her hands trembled as she photographed the tag. Couldn't be a coincidence. This was Asha's sleeping bag. But the body inside wasn't Asha, it was male. What the hell had happened here? Chun immediately called her lieutenant. We need to treat this as a homicide and a priority case. The sleeping bag belongs to Asha, the hiker who went missing in 2012. But the body inside isn't her. We've got a major situation here. The wheels started turning fast. By morning, a full investigative team was assembled. The FBI was notified, given the possibility that this involved crimes across state lines. The sleeping bag was sent to the forensics lab for detailed analysis. The remains were fast-tracked for identification. Within 48 hours, they had a match. The dental records belonged to Milo Roddick, the 24-year-old from Arizona who had vanished during the same weekend as Asha, from the same general area, in September 2012. The case that had been frozen for 6 years suddenly exploded into life. Detective Chun sat in her office, staring at the file in front of her. 2 missing persons from September 2012. Milo's body found in Asha's sleeping bag. Asha still missing. The connection was undeniable now. These weren't 2 separate disappearances. They were linked, and that meant someone had killed Milo, used Asha's sleeping bag to dispose of the body, and done something with Asha herself. This wasn't a hiking accident. This was murder, and the killer had been free for 6 years. Chun picked up her phone and called Linda, Asha's mother. It was the hardest call she'd ever had to make. Linda, we found something, Chun said gently. We found a body in the area where Asha went missing. But it's not Asha. It's a young man named Milo Roddick. And he was found in Asha's sleeping bag. The silence on the other end of the line lasted several long seconds. What does that mean? Linda finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. It means we're reopening Asha's case as a homicide investigation, Chun said. It means we believe someone killed Milo and took Asha. And we're going to find out who. Linda began to cry. Not the devastated sobs of fresh grief, but the exhausted weeping of someone who'd been waiting 6 years for answers and was finally getting somewhere. Find out what happened to my daughter, Linda said through her tears. Please, Sarah, find out what happened to my baby. I will, Chun promised. I won't stop until we have answers. And she meant it. The cold case had just become the hottest investigation in Utah. Detective Sarah Chin knew she needed help. This case had expanded beyond anything she'd handled before. Multiple victims, multiple states, potential federal crimes, and a trail that was 6 years cold. She couldn't do this alone. Within a week of identifying Milo Roddick's remains, Chun had assembled a task force. Representatives from the FBI, the Utah State Bureau of Investigation, the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and several local agencies came together with one goal: figure out what happened in September 2012 and bring the person responsible to justice. The task force set up operations in a conference room at the Summit County Sheriff's Office. Whiteboards covered the walls, filled with timelines, photos, maps, and sticky notes with questions. Two names sat at the center of everything: Asha and Milo. The first question the task force had to answer was, how were Asha and Milo connected? FBI Special Agent Marcus Reynolds took the lead on the digital investigation. He was a cyber specialist who'd spent the last decade tracking criminals through their online footprints. If there was a connection between these two victims in the digital world, Reynolds would find it. He started with Asha's laptop, which had been in evidence storage since 2012. He went through her browser history, her email accounts, her social media profiles, and most importantly, her activity on the Trail Seekers hiking forum. That's where he found the connection. Trailblazer_24, the username that Detective Chun had noted years earlier, turned out to be Milo Roddick. Reynolds was able to confirm this through a combination of IP address logs that the forum had retained, digital forensic analysis of posting patterns, and linguistic analysis that matched the writing style in Milo's forum posts to emails from his personal account. Asha and Milo had been online friends. They'd never met in person, but they'd exchanged dozens of messages over the months leading up to their disappearances. The messages were friendly, focused on hiking topics. Nothing romantic, nothing suspicious on the surface. But then Reynolds found something that changed everything. Buried in Asha's email trash folder, messages she deleted but that were still recoverable, was a private message from Milo dated September 10, 2012, 5 days before Asha's trip. The message read, "Hey Asha, I know this is going to sound weird, but I really need to talk to someone I trust, and I feel like I can trust you even though we've never met in person. I've gotten myself into something bad, work-related stuff that I can't talk about in detail online. I'm planning to be in Utah next weekend, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to meet up in person. I'm trying to figure out how to get out of this situation, and I could really use some advice from someone who doesn't know my real-life circle. I promise I'm not a creep or anything. I just need a friend. Let me know. Milo." Asha had responded the next day, "Hey Milo, that sounds serious. I'm actually planning a solo hiking trip next weekend in the Uintas. If you want to meet up, I could adjust my route. There's a trailhead near Silus Lake that's easy to find. We could meet there on Sunday afternoon, September 16th, around 2 p.m. I'm happy to listen and help if I can. Stay strong." Asha. Milo's response, "You're a lifesaver. I'll be there. Thank you so much." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, feeling the pieces start to fall into place. Milo had reached out to Asha for help with some kind of work-related problem. They'd arranged to meet, and then both of them vanished. But what was the work-related stuff Milo had mentioned? What had he gotten himself into? That investigation fell to FBI Special Agent Carla Domingo, who specialized in organized crime. She started digging into Milo's employment history, his financial records, his known associates. What she found was troubling. Milo had worked for a legitimate logistics company, but his bank records showed deposits that didn't match his official salary. Cash deposits always under $10,000, the threshold that triggers automatic reporting to the IRS, made every few weeks throughout the summer of 2012. Someone had been paying Milo under the table. Domingo reached out to Milo's former employer, a logistics company called Western Transport Solutions. She spoke with the HR director who pulled Milo's employment file. "We had some concerns about Milo before he disappeared," the HR director admitted. "There were package discrepancies on his routes, items that should have been delivered but weren't. We were planning to conduct a formal investigation, but then he vanished and we never got the chance." "Did you suspect he was stealing?" Domingo asked. "That was our working theory, but we never had proof." Domingo then tracked down Milo's former roommate, Jake, who was still living in Tempe. She drove down to Arizona to interview him in person. Jake, now 30 years old and working as an accountant, welcomed Domingo into his home. He said he'd always wondered what happened to his friend. "Did Milo ever mention being involved in anything illegal?" Domingo asked. Jake hesitated, then nodded. "He never gave me details, but he was definitely stressed about something in the weeks before he disappeared. He kept getting phone calls that he'd take outside or in his room. He was suddenly flush with cash, taking us all out to bars, buying rounds of drinks, which wasn't like him because he'd been broke for months. Did you ever hear him mention anyone by name? Anyone he was working with or for? Jake thought for a moment. There was one name. He mentioned it once when he was on the phone. I walked into the apartment while he was talking, and he quickly ended the call. But I heard him say something like, "I told you, Dante. I need more time." When I asked who Dante was, Milo got really defensive and said it was nobody, just work stuff. Dante. Domingo felt her investigator instincts tingle. She thanked Jake and headed back to her car, immediately running a database search for anyone named Dante with criminal connections in the Arizona area. She hit pay dirt immediately. Dante Voss, 47 years old, in 2012. Criminal record including assault, drug trafficking, and extortion. Known to operate courier networks for transporting illegal goods. Last known address in Phoenix, Arizona. Domingo called Detective Chun immediately. "I think I found our suspect." The task force descended on Dante Voss's history like hunters on a blood trail. They obtained warrants for his financial records, phone records, and property records. They interviewed people who'd been arrested alongside Voss in previous cases. They built a profile of a career criminal who was smart, paranoid, and ruthless. Voss's phone records from September 2012 showed several calls to a number registered to Milo Roddick. The last call was on September 15th, the day before Milo and Asha were supposed to meet. The task force also discovered that Voss owned multiple vehicles, including a white panel van that he'd registered under a business name. Traffic camera footage from September 2012, pulled from archives after weeks of searching, showed a white panel van traveling north on I-15 toward Utah on September 15th. The van had returned to Arizona on September 17th. The timeline was coming together. Voss had followed Milo to Utah. He'd confronted Milo and Asha at or near the trailhead. He'd killed Milo, disposed of the body in Silus Lake using Asha's sleeping bag, and taken Asha with him. But where was Asha? That was the question that haunted Detective Chun. Had Voss killed her too? Was her body somewhere else in the wilderness? Or had she survived longer, held captive by Voss for reasons the investigators could only speculate about? The forensic analysis of Asha's sleeping bag provided some answers. Blood evidence showed that Milo had been shot at close range. The bullet had passed through his body and stained the interior of the sleeping bag. But there was also a second blood type present on the exterior of the bag. DNA analysis matched it to Asha. She'd been injured. Whether that injury had been fatal or not, they couldn't tell. But she'd been bleeding when Voss put Milo's body in her sleeping bag. The task force worked around the clock. They recanvassed the area around Silus Lake, looking for any additional evidence. They interviewed everyone who'd been camping in the area in September 2012. A painstaking process that required tracking down people 6 years later and asking them about a weekend they probably barely remembered. And then they got the break they'd been waiting for. A witness came forward. Someone who'd been too scared to speak up 6 years ago but who'd carried the weight of what they'd seen ever since. Her name was Rosa Martinez, 54 years old, a motel housekeeper who'd been working at the Starlight Motor Inn in Heber City, Utah, for 15 years. Rosa saw the news reports about the body found in Silus Lake. She saw Milo Roddick's photo on the television. And she saw Dante Voss's photo when the media reported that he was a person of interest in the investigation. She recognized them both. For 6 years, Rosa had carried a secret. She'd witnessed something in September 2012 that had frightened her so badly that she'd convinced herself to forget it, to pretend it hadn't happened. But now, with the news reports and the knowledge that a young man had been murdered, she couldn't stay silent anymore. She called the tip line that the task force had set up. Detective Chun personally drove to Rosa's home to interview her. Rosa sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and told her story. It was September 16, 2012. Rosa began, her voice shaking. "I remember because it was my daughter's birthday the next day. I was working the evening shift at the Starlight, cleaning rooms. Around 6 o'clock, I went to clean room 114. I knocked, called out housekeeping, and didn't hear anything, so I used my key to go in." She paused, taking a sip of coffee. The room was occupied. There were 3 people there, 2 young people sitting on one of the beds, and an older man standing by the door. The young woman looked terrified. Her wrist was bandaged with what looked like a torn t-shirt, and there was blood on it. The young man was sitting very still, very pale. And the older man, the one by the door, he turned and looked at me, and his eyes. Rosa's voice trailed off. She took a breath and continued. He told me to get out. Just get out now. I apologized for interrupting and backed out of the room as fast as I could. My heart was pounding. Something was very, very wrong in that room. I could feel it, but I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but I'm undocumented. I was undocumented then. I was terrified that if I called the police, I'd be arrested and deported. My whole family depends on me. So I convinced myself that maybe I'd misread the situation, that maybe it was just a family argument or something. I tried to forget about it. Chun showed Rosa photos. Do you recognize any of these people? Rosa pointed immediately to Milo's photo. That's the young man from the room. Then she pointed to Asha's photo. That's the young woman. I'm certain. Finally, she pointed to Dante Voss's photo. And that's the older man who told me to leave. I'll never forget his face. Chun felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the evidence that placed all 3 individuals together at the same place and time. Rosa, I need you to understand how important this testimony is, Chun said gently. You've just given us the missing piece of this investigation. Would you be willing to testify to this in court? Rosa nodded, tears in her eyes. I should have said something 6 years ago. Maybe I could have saved that young woman. I've thought about it every single day since I saw the news. I have to do the right thing now, even if it's late. You're doing the right thing, Chun assured her. And I want you to know, your immigration status is not going to be a problem. We'll work with you to make sure you're protected. With Rosa's testimony, the task force had enough to move forward. They obtained arrest warrants for Dante Voss on charges of murder, kidnapping, and unlawful disposal of human remains. But they still needed to find him. Voss had gone to ground. His last known address in Phoenix was abandoned. He'd cleared out months ago, possibly sensing that investigators were closing in. His phone number was disconnected. His associates claimed they hadn't seen him in years. The U.S. Marshal Service joined the hunt. Voss's photo was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. His face appeared on the FBI's most wanted list. Media outlets ran stories about the manhunt, asking the public for help. For 3 weeks, there was no sign of him. And then, on a routine traffic stop in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a police officer ran the license plate of a car that had been speeding. The plate came back registered to a name the officer didn't recognize, but when he ran the driver's license of the man behind the wheel, a man with a beard and longer hair than in his booking photos, it flagged as an active warrant. The officer called for backup and approached the vehicle carefully. Dante Voss was taken into custody without incident. He didn't resist. He didn't say a word. When Detective Chun got the call that Voss was in custody, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Relief, satisfaction, anger, and grief all mixed together. She thought of Asha's mother, Linda, who'd been waiting 6 years for this moment. She thought of Milo's mother, Elena, who'd finally have some answers about what happened to her son. And she thought of Asha herself, whose fate was still unknown but whose case had finally, broken wide open. Voss was extradited to Utah to face charges. He was arraigned on 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Milo Roddick, one for Asha, based on the theory that she'd also been killed, even though her body hadn't been recovered, along with charges of kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and unlawful disposal of human remains. He pled not guilty to all charges. His attorney, a public defender named Marcus Brennan, argued that the evidence was circumstantial. There was no direct physical evidence linking Voss to Milo's death. No murder weapon had been found. No forensic evidence placed Voss at Silus Lake. The motel sighting was compelling, but eyewitness testimony alone wasn't enough to convict on murder charges. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Catherine Walsh, disagreed. She believed the totality of the evidence, the digital trail, the financial records, the witness testimony, the timeline, would be enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. The case was going to trial. But before the trial began, the task force made one more attempt to find Asha's remains. They brought in cadaver dogs. They used ground-penetrating radar. They searched every inch of wilderness within a 50-mile radius of Silus Lake. They never found her. Detective Chun had to accept the painful reality that Asha's body might never be recovered. The wilderness was vast, and Voss had had years to cover his tracks. Without a confession, and Voss wasn't talking, they might never know where Asha's final resting place was. But they could still get justice for both victims. The trial would move forward with or without Asha's remains. And Detective Chun was determined to make sure Dante Voss spent the rest of his life in prison for what he'd done. The arrest of Dante Voss sent shockwaves through multiple communities, not just in Utah and Arizona, but in the online hiking forums where Asha and Milo had been beloved members. When news broke that the man responsible for Milo's death and Asha's disappearance had been caught, the Trail Seekers Forum exploded with activity. Members who'd mourned Asha's disappearance 6 years earlier returned to share their grief, their anger, and their relief that the person responsible was finally in custody. One forum member wrote, "I still remember Asha's trip reports. She had this way of describing the mountains that made you feel like you were there with her. I can't believe someone took that light away from the world. I hope justice is served." Another wrote, "Milo was one of us. He loved the wilderness just like we do. To think that he reached out for help and that's what got him killed. It's devastating. But at least now we know what happened. At least now there's a chance for justice." The hiking community rallied around the families of the victims. A GoFundMe page was set up to help cover the costs of the upcoming trial, travel expenses for family members, support for the legal team, memorial funds. It raised over $100,000 in the first week. Linda, Asha's mother, released a statement through the sheriff's office. "For 6 years, we've lived in the dark, not knowing what happened to our beautiful daughter. Today, we finally have some answers. While our grief is profound and will never truly end, we are grateful to the investigators who never gave up on Asha's case. We are grateful to the witness who found the courage to come forward. And we are grateful that the person responsible will face justice. We still don't know where Asha is, and that's a pain that continues to haunt us every day. But we know the truth now, and that matters." Elena, Milo's mother, also released a statement. "My son made mistakes. He got involved with the wrong people and it cost him his life. But Milo was a good person who was trying to do the right thing. He reached out for help and that decision led to his murder. No parent should have to bury their child, and I haven't even been able to do that until now. At least Milo can have a proper funeral. At least I can visit his grave and tell him how much I love him. At least the person who took him from us will be held accountable." The media coverage was intense. True crime podcasts covered the case. Documentary filmmakers reached out to the families, asking for interviews. The story had all the elements that captured public attention. A mysterious disappearance, a cold case solved years later, a chance discovery that broke everything open, and a dangerous criminal finally brought to justice. But for the investigators, the media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept pressure on the justice system to ensure a thorough prosecution. On the other hand, it created challenges for jury selection. Finding 12 people who hadn't already formed opinions about the case would be difficult. Detective Chin found herself thrust into the spotlight. News outlets wanted interviews. Podcasters wanted to hear the story of how she'd never given up on Asha's case. The sheriff's office eventually assigned a public information officer to handle media requests so that Chun could focus on preparing for trial. But Chun was uncomfortable with the attention. She didn't solve this case alone. She had an entire task force, plus the witness who came forward, plus the fisherman who found the body. She was just one person in a chain of people who'd worked to bring the truth to light. What mattered to her wasn't the recognition. It was the promise she'd made to Linda 6 years ago. "I will never stop looking for answers about what happened to your daughter." She'd kept that promise. And now she had to make sure the prosecution succeeded in court. The pretrial hearings began in early 2019. Defense attorney Marcus Brennan filed multiple motions: motion to suppress evidence, motion to exclude the motel witness testimony, motion to sever the charges related to Asha from the charges related to Milo. Judge Patricia Morrison, a no-nonsense jurist with 20 years on the bench, denied most of the motions. The evidence would be admissible. Rosa Martinez would be allowed to testify, and the charges would be tried together, since they were part of the same criminal episode. The trial was scheduled for June 2019. In the months leading up to the trial, both sides prepared their cases. The prosecution built a narrative. Dante Voss was a violent criminal who ran an illegal courier operation. Milo Roddick worked for him but wanted out. When Voss discovered Milo was meeting with someone who might convince him to go to the authorities, Voss followed Milo to Utah, confronted him and Asha at the motel, killed Milo, and kidnapped and murdered Asha to eliminate witnesses. The evidence, digital, financial, forensic, and eyewitness, all supported this narrative. The defense built a counter-narrative. The evidence was circumstantial. There was no murder weapon. No forensic evidence directly linked Voss to the crime scene at Silus Lake. The motel witness had waited 6 years to come forward, raising questions about the reliability of her memory. The prosecution couldn't even prove Asha was dead. There was no body, no forensic evidence of her death, nothing but speculation. The charges should be dismissed for lack of evidence. It would be up to a jury to decide who was telling the truth. The trial of Dante Voss began on June 3, 2019, in the Summit County District Court. The courtroom was packed. Family members of the victims, journalists, members of the hiking community, and curious members of the public who'd followed the case in the media. Judge Morrison took the bench and addressed the packed courtroom. "This is a court of law, not a media circus. I expect everyone in this room to conduct themselves with dignity and respect for the process. Any disruptions will result in immediate removal." Jury selection took 3 days. The defense and prosecution questioned dozens of potential jurors, looking for people who could be fair and impartial despite the heavy media coverage. Eventually, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were seated, a mix of men and women, ranging in age from 28 to 64, representing various backgrounds and professions. Assistant District Attorney Catherine Walsh delivered the prosecution's opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a man who thought he could get away with murder. Dante Voss." She turned and pointed at the defendant, who sat stone-faced at the defense table, "is a career criminal who has spent his life exploiting others for profit. In September 2012, he ran an operation using young people to transport illegal goods across state lines. One of those young people was Milo Roddick, a 24-year-old from Arizona who got involved in Voss's operation to pay off debts. But Milo had a conscience. He wanted out. And when he reached out to a friend, a young woman named Asha, for advice, Dante Voss saw that as a threat. So he followed Milo to Utah. He confronted Milo and Asha at the Starlight Motor Inn. And then he killed them both to silence them forever." Walsh paused, making eye contact with each juror. "Over the course of this trial, you will hear testimony from investigators who painstakingly pieced together what happened. You will hear from a witness who saw all 3 individuals together on the day of the murders. You will hear forensic evidence about how Milo's body was disposed of in a remote lake, hidden in a sleeping bag for 6 years until a fisherman made a grim discovery. You will see financial records, phone records, and digital evidence that connects Dante Voss to both victims. And when you've heard all the evidence, you will reach the only logical conclusion. Dante Voss is guilty of murder." Defense attorney Marcus Brennan gave the defense's opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution just told you a compelling story, but that's all it is, a story. The theory, not facts. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client, Dante Voss, committed these terrible crimes. But when you actually examine the evidence, you'll see that there are huge gaps. No murder weapon. No direct forensic evidence linking Mr. Voss to the death of Milo Roddick. No proof whatsoever that Asha is even dead. For all we know, she's alive somewhere, having chosen to disappear for her own reasons. The prosecution's case is built on speculation, circumstantial evidence, and a witness who waited 6 years to come forward with her story. That's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a house of cards. And by the end of this trial, you'll see that house of cards collapse. The prosecution began presenting its case. First up was Mark Stevens, the fisherman who discovered the sleeping bag at Silus Lake. He described the moment he pulled the waterlogged bag from the depths, the sick feeling in his stomach when he realized what he'd found. "I've been fishing for 40 years, Mark testified. "I've pulled up all kinds of things from lakes, old tires, sunken boats, lost fishing gear, but I'd never found anything like that. And I hope I never do again." Next was Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the medical examiner, who testified about the condition of Milo Roddick's remains and the cause of death. "Based on the skeletal trauma, specifically damage to the ribs and vertebrae, I determined that Mr. Roddick died from a gunshot wound to the torso," Dr. Hernandez testified. "The bullet would have passed through vital organs, causing rapid death. The body was then placed in the sleeping bag and submerged in water, where it remained for approximately 6 years before being discovered." The defense cross-examined, trying to establish doubt. "Dr. Hernandez, you can't definitively say who shot Mr. Roddick, can you?" "No, I cannot determine the identity of the shooter from the remains alone." "And you can't say when exactly he was shot, other than sometime before his body ended up in the lake?" "The condition of the remains only allows me to estimate that he'd been deceased and submerged for several years. I cannot pinpoint the exact day or hour of death." "So the actual circumstances of Mr. Roddick's death, where it happened, who did it, why, are all unknown to you?" "The physical evidence tells me how he died. The circumstances surrounding his death would require additional evidence beyond my examination." The prosecution called FBI Special Agent Marcus Reynolds to testify about the digital evidence. Reynolds walked the jury through his investigation, how he'd traced the connection between Asha and Milo through the Trail Seekers forum, how he'd recovered the deleted messages showing they'd planned to meet, how the timeline all aligned with their disappearances. "In my professional opinion," Reynolds testified, "Asha and Milo arranged to meet on September 16, 2012, at a trailhead near Silus Lake. Both of them vanished that same weekend. That's not a coincidence." The defense challenged this. "Agent Reynolds, the messages you recovered don't mention my client at all, do they?" "No, they do not." "So you have no evidence that Dante Voss knew about this meeting or was present at this meeting?" "Not from the digital evidence alone, no. But when combined with the other evidence in this case." "Just answer the question, Agent Reynolds. Do the messages between Asha and Milo mention Dante Voss?" "No." The prosecution called FBI Special Agent Carla Domingo to testify about Milo's connection to Dante Voss. She explained the courier operation, the under-the-table payments, the phone records showing contact between Milo and Voss in the days before the murders. "Milo Roddick was scared," Domingo testified. "He reached out to Asha because he wanted to get out of the criminal enterprise he'd become involved in. And Dante Voss couldn't allow that to happen." The defense cross-examined. "Agent Domingo, you testified that Mr. Roddick was involved in transporting illegal goods. What evidence do you have that my client was the one running this operation?" "Mr. Roddick's phone records show multiple calls to a number registered to Dante Voss. His bank records show cash deposits that align with the timing of courier runs. And witnesses who knew Mr. Roddick before his death stated that he'd mentioned working for someone named Dante. But you never actually caught my client in possession of illegal goods, did you? You never arrested him for running a courier operation?" "No, because he covered his tracks well. That's how these operations work." "So you're asking the jury to speculate about criminal activity you never actually proved?" "I'm presenting evidence of a pattern of behavior that provides motive for murder." The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Rosa Martinez took the stand. Rosa, dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, looked nervous but determined as she was sworn in. Prosecutor Walsh gently guided her through her testimony. "Ms. Martinez, can you tell the jury what you saw on September 16, 2012? Rosa recounted the story, walking into room 114 at the Starlight Motor Inn, seeing 3 people, the young woman's bandaged and bloodied wrist, the terrified expressions, the older man who ordered her out of the room. And Ms. Martinez, do you see that older man in the courtroom today? Yes. Rosa pointed directly at Dante Voss. That's him. That's the man who was in the room. The courtroom was silent as Rosa's testimony hung in the air. The defense's cross-examination was aggressive. Marcus Brennan tried to poke holes in Rosa's memory. Ms. Martinez, you waited 6 years to come forward with this story. Why? I was afraid, Rosa said quietly. I was undocumented at the time. I was scared of being deported. So for 6 years, you said nothing while 2 families suffered, not knowing what happened to their loved ones? I know. I feel terrible about it. But I'm here now. I'm telling the truth now. How can the jury trust that your memory is accurate after all this time? Can you honestly say you remember every detail clearly? I remember their faces, Rosa said firmly. I remember how scared they looked. And I remember him. She pointed at Voss again. I'll never forget his face. The defense also pointed out inconsistencies. Rosa hadn't reported which room number she'd seen the 3 people in. She'd had to check old work logs to remember it was room 114. She couldn't remember exactly what time of day it had been, only that it was evening. She couldn't remember what anyone was wearing. But despite the defense's efforts, Rosa's core testimony remained consistent. She'd seen Asha, Milo, and Dante Voss together in that motel room, and something had been very, very wrong. The prosecution rested its case after 2 weeks of testimony. The defense called its own witnesses, character witnesses who testified that Dante Voss, despite his criminal record, wasn't a violent person. A forensic expert who argued that the lack of physical evidence at the crime scene created reasonable doubt. And Voss's sister, who testified that her brother had been in Arizona during the weekend in question. But the prosecution tore apart the sister's alibi testimony on cross-examination, pointing out that she'd initially told investigators she couldn't remember where her brother had been that weekend and had only developed a clear memory of his whereabouts after he was arrested. The most controversial decision of the trial was whether Dante Voss would take the stand in his own defense. His attorney advised against it. Voss had a criminal record, which the prosecution would be allowed to bring up during cross-examination. And if he testified, he'd have to answer questions about his courier operation, his connection to Milo, and his whereabouts in September 2012. Any slip-up, any inconsistency, could destroy the defense. Voss chose not to testify. He exercised his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Both sides delivered closing arguments. The prosecution argued that the totality of the evidence, the digital connections, the financial records, the phone calls, the witness testimony, the forensic evidence, all pointed to one conclusion. Dante Voss had murdered Milo Roddick and Asha to protect his criminal enterprise. The defense argued that circumstantial evidence wasn't enough. That speculation wasn't proof. That the prosecution hadn't met its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Judge Morrison gave the jury its instructions, and they retired to deliberate. The jury deliberated for 4 days. For agonizing days during which Linda sat in her hotel room, unable to eat, unable to sleep, just waiting for the phone call that would tell her it was time to return to court. Detective Chun waited too. She'd done everything she could. She'd investigated every lead, chased down every piece of evidence, built the strongest case possible. Now it was out of her hands. It was up to 12 strangers to decide if justice would be served. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Linda sat in the front row, clutching the hands of her sister on one side and her brother on the other. Elena, Milo's mother, sat across the aisle, her face pale and drawn. Judge Morrison entered. All rise. Everyone stood as the judge took her seat, then sat down again as she instructed. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Morrison asked. The jury foreman, a 52-year-old high school teacher, stood. We have, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff. The bailiff took the paper from the foreman and delivered it to Judge Morrison. She reviewed it silently, her expression giving nothing away, then handed it back to the bailiff to return to the foreman. The defendant will please rise. Dante Voss stood, his attorney beside him. His face remained impassive, but Detective Chun noticed his hands were shaking slightly. On the charge of first-degree murder of Milo Roddick, how do you find? The foreman's voice was clear and firm. We find the defendant, Dante Voss, guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Elena began to cry, her shoulders shaking with 6 years of grief finally finding release. On the charge of kidnapping Asha, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of tampering with evidence, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of unlawful disposal of human remains, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Asha, however, the jury had reached a different conclusion. Without a body, without definitive proof that she was dead, they couldn't convict on that charge. They found Voss not guilty of Asha's murder. But the guilty verdict on the other charges, particularly the murder of Milo Roddick, carried a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Morrison scheduled a sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later. Voss was remanded into custody and led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Linda sat in the courtroom long after everyone else had left, tears streaming down her face. Detective Chun sat down beside her, not saying anything, just being present. He killed my baby, Linda finally said, and we'll never know where she is. We'll never be able to bring her home. I know, Chin said quietly. I'm so sorry, but he's going to prison for the rest of his life. That matters, doesn't it? It does. It absolutely does. 3 weeks later, the sentencing hearing took place. This was the moment when victims and their families could address the court, giving what's called a victim impact statement. Elena, Milo's mother, spoke first. She stood at the podium, her prepared statement trembling in her hands, and looked directly at Dante Voss. You took my son from me, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Milo was a good person who made a mistake. He got involved with you and it cost him his life. He was trying to do the right thing. He was trying to get out, and you killed him for it. You took my son, put his body in a sleeping bag, and threw him in a lake like he was garbage. I will never hold my son again. I will never hear his voice or see his smile. You took that from me, and I hope you spend every single day for the rest of your life thinking about what you did. Then Linda took the podium. She'd written pages and pages of notes, but when the moment came, she set her papers aside and spoke from the heart. Asha was the light of my life. She was kind, brave, adventurous, and full of joy. She loved the mountains. She loved animals. She loved life. And you extinguished that light. You took her from us, and you won't even tell us where she is. That's a cruelty beyond measure. I can't bury my daughter. I can't visit her grave. I can't say goodbye. You've taken even that from me. I want you to know that we will never stop looking for Asha. We will search those mountains until we find her, and when we do, we'll bring her home where she belongs. And you'll spend the rest of your life in a cage, knowing that you failed to erase her. Asha's memory lives on. Her spirit lives on. And justice has been served. Judge Morrison then addressed Dante Voss directly. Mr. Voss, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of heinous crimes. You murdered a young man who was trying to escape your criminal enterprise. You kidnapped and, in all likelihood, murdered a young woman whose only crime was trying to help a friend. You have shown no remorse. You have offered no assistance in helping these families find closure. You are a danger to society and will remain so for the rest of your natural life. She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Milo Roddick, plus additional consecutive sentences for the other charges. In total, Dante Voss would spend the rest of his life behind bars with no chance of ever being released. Voss was led out of the courtroom. He never looked at the families. He never showed any emotion. He simply walked away, just as he'd tried to walk away from his crimes 6 years earlier. But this time, justice caught up with him. The conviction of Dante Voss had ripple effects that extended far beyond the courtroom. In the immediate aftermath, the case prompted changes to how missing person investigations are conducted, particularly in multi-state cases. The fact that Asha's disappearance in Utah and Milo's disappearance in Arizona had been investigated as completely separate cases, with no one connecting them until Milo's body was discovered 6 years later, highlighted a critical flaw in the system. The FBI expanded its missing persons database protocols, implementing better cross-referencing systems that would flag potential connections between cases based on location, timing, and other factors. If a similar situation occurred today, investigators would be more likely to spot the connection between two people who vanished from the same area during the same time frame. Law enforcement agencies also began taking online connections more seriously. The fact that Asha and Milo knew each other through a hiking forum, a connection that initially seemed insignificant, turned out to be the key to understanding what happened to them. Investigators learned to dig deeper into victims' digital lives, to map out their online relationships, and to consider that online friendships could be just as significant as in-person connections. The case also shined a spotlight on the courage it takes for witnesses to come forward. Rosa Martinez, the motel housekeeper, had been too afraid to speak up for 6 years because of her immigration status. Her story prompted discussions about how to create safe reporting mechanisms for undocumented immigrants who witness crimes, ensuring that fear of deportation doesn't prevent people from helping solve serious cases. Several immigrant rights organizations worked with law enforcement to develop protocols that would protect witnesses like Rosa while still allowing them to assist in criminal investigations. The goal was to send a clear message. If you have information about a crime, we want to hear from you, regardless of your immigration status. For the hiking community, particularly those active in online forums like trail seekers, the case was a sobering reminder that danger doesn't always come from the wilderness itself. Asha and Milo had both been experienced hikers, well prepared for the physical challenges of backcountry travel. They knew how to handle bad weather, navigate difficult terrain, and survive in remote areas. But none of that preparation mattered when they encountered a human threat. The Trail Seekers Forum implemented new safety protocols, encouraging members to share detailed trip plans not just with family but with trusted online friends. They created a buddy system where members could check in with each other during solo trips. They published guides about situational awareness, recognizing warning signs of danger, and what to do if you suspect someone you've met online might have ill intentions. The case also sparked conversations about the particular vulnerabilities of solo hikers. While most solo hiking experiences are safe and enriching, the reality is that hiking alone means there's no one to help if something goes wrong, whether that something is a twisted ankle or a violent criminal. Some people argued that Asha shouldn't have been hiking alone, that she put herself at unnecessary risk. But the hiking community pushed back hard against that narrative. Asha had every right to pursue her passion. The problem wasn't that she hiked alone. The problem was that a violent criminal chose to harm her. Victim blaming, they argued, only shifts responsibility away from the person who actually committed the crime. For Detective Sarah Chun, the resolution of the case was both satisfying and heartbreaking. She'd kept her promise to Linda. She'd never stopped looking for answers about what happened to Asha, and she'd succeeded in bringing Asha's killer to justice. But Asha's body was still out there somewhere, hidden in the vast wilderness she'd loved so much, and that would haunt Chun for the rest of her career. In the years following the trial, Chun participated in several more searches for Asha's remains. Volunteers combed the areas around Silus Lake, the trailheads Asha had mentioned in her trip plan, and locations identified through interviews with Dante Voss's known associates. Though Voss himself refused to cooperate or provide any information about where he'd disposed of Asha's body, they never found her. Some cases are solved but not truly closed. This was one of them. Linda continued her advocacy work for families of missing persons. She became a voice for others navigating the nightmare of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. She lobbied for better funding for cold case units, better training for investigators, and better support services for families. And every year, on Asha's birthday, she organized that memorial hike in her daughter's honor. The event grew each year, dozens, then hundreds of people showing up to walk the trails Asha had loved, to remember a young woman whose light had been extinguished too soon, and to send a message that she hadn't been forgotten. At the 2020 memorial hike, 8 years after Asha's disappearance, Linda stood at the trailhead where Asha's car had been found and addressed the crowd. 8 years ago, my daughter walked into these mountains and never came home, she said, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. For 6 of those years, we didn't know what happened to her. We didn't know if she'd been hurt, if she was alive somewhere, if we'd ever see her again. The not knowing was torture. But 2 years ago, we got answers. Not all the answers, we still don't know where Asha is, but we know the truth about what happened to her. And we know that the person responsible is in prison, where he belongs. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. People who'd come to honor a woman most of them had never met. Asha loved these mountains. She felt most alive out here, surrounded by nature, challenging herself, pushing her limits. And even though she's gone, even though we can't hold her or hear her laugh or see her smile, her spirit is still here. Every time we hike these trails, every time we stand on a summit and feel that sense of accomplishment and awe, every time we help a fellow hiker or share a trail recommendation or encourage someone to pursue their outdoor dreams, Asha is there. Her legacy is there. The crowd applauded, many wiping away tears. So today, as we hike in her memory, I want us all to remember, Asha's story doesn't end with tragedy. It ends with justice. It ends with community. It ends with all of us coming together to make sure she's never forgotten. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for keeping her memory alive. The hikers set off on the trail, hundreds of people walking in honor of one woman who'd loved the wilderness and paid the ultimate price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But she wasn't just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a member of a community that still loved her and remembered her and refused to let her story be erased by violence. That's the true measure of a life. Not how it ends, but how it's remembered. And so we reach the end of this story. The end, but not quite a conclusion, because Asha is still out there somewhere, still missing, still waiting to be found and brought home. This case reminds us of several important truths. First, that cold cases can be solved. 6 years is a long time, long enough for evidence to degrade, witnesses to forget, trails to go cold. But this case broke wide open because investigators refused to give up, because a witness found the courage to come forward despite her fears, and because a fisherman made a chance discovery that changed everything. No case is ever truly hopeless. Justice may be delayed, but it isn't necessarily denied. Second, that modern investigative techniques, particularly digital forensics, have revolutionized how cold cases are approached. The online connection between Asha and Milo, which would have been nearly impossible to discover in an earlier era, became the linchpin of the entire investigation. Our digital footprints can haunt us or help us, depending on which side of the law we're on. Third, that every person who goes missing leaves behind a community of people who love them and who will never stop looking for answers. Linda's tireless advocacy, Elena's refusal to let Milo be forgotten, the hiking community's commitment to keeping Asha's memory alive. These are the forces that ultimately led to justice. Families and communities are often the driving force that keeps cold cases from being truly forgotten. Fourth, that witnesses matter. Rosa Martinez waited 6 years to come forward, paralyzed by fear. But when she finally found the courage to speak up, her testimony was crucial to securing a conviction. If you have information about a crime, no matter how small or insignificant it seems, please contact law enforcement. You might be the piece of the puzzle that solves the entire case. And if you're afraid to come forward because of your immigration status or other concerns, reach out to victim advocacy organizations that can help protect you while you help investigators. And finally, that evil doesn't always announce itself. Dante Voss was a man who seemed ordinary enough to his neighbors, unremarkable enough to blend in. But he was a predator who destroyed lives to protect his criminal enterprise. The people we pass on the street, the folks we see at the grocery store, the person pumping gas at the next pump over, any of them could be carrying dark secrets. We can't live in fear of everyone around us, but we can stay aware, trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and look out for each other. This case is a reminder that the wilderness, as beautiful and awe-inspiring as it is, can also be a dangerous place. Not because of the weather or the wildlife or the terrain, but because sometimes human threats follow us even into remote areas. That doesn't mean we should stop hiking or stop seeking adventure. It means we should be smart, prepare thoroughly, tell people where we're going, check in regularly, and trust our gut if a situation feels off. Asha did everything right. She filed a trip plan. She had an emergency communication device. She checked in with family. She took every precaution a responsible solo hiker should take. Her disappearance wasn't the result of carelessness or naivety. It was the result of crossing paths with a violent criminal who saw her as a threat to be eliminated. That could have happened to anyone. But her story, tragic as it is, has made a difference. The changes to missing persons investigation protocols, the increased awareness in hiking communities about safety measures, the conversations about protecting vulnerable witnesses, these are all part of Asha's legacy. Her life mattered, and her case, even unfinished as it is, has helped other people and potentially prevented other tragedies. To Linda, to Elena, and to all the families out there still waiting for loved ones to come home, you are not forgotten. There are investigators, volunteers, advocates, and community members who care about your missing loved ones and who will keep searching for answers. Don't give up hope. Don't stop sharing your loved one's story. Don't stop pushing for justice. And to anyone listening who has information about a missing person or an unsolved case, please reach out. Your tip could be the one that finally brings someone home. Your courage could be what gives a family the closure they've been waiting years to receive. This case also stands as a testament to the investigative work that happens behind the scenes. The painstaking digital forensics, the re-interviewing of witnesses, the coordination between agencies across state lines, the forensic analysis that can extract evidence from remains that have been submerged for years. The people who work cold cases are dedicated professionals who carry these victim stories with them, who think about them during their off hours, who refuse to let files gather dust. They deserve our recognition and our support. And finally, to Asha and Milo, you are remembered. Your stories have been told. The person who took you from this world is behind bars, where he will remain for the rest of his life. You didn't die in vain. Your cases have changed how investigations are conducted, how communities support each other, and how we think about safety and justice. That's not nothing. That's a legacy that will outlast your killer and will continue to make a difference for years to come. Rest in peace wherever you are. With that said, thanks for listening to this deep dive into the Utah 2012 cold case. A case that was solved after 6 years by determination, technology, courage, and a little bit of luck. It's a reminder that in the fight for justice, we should never give up, never stop searching, and never forget the people we've lost. Until next time, stay safe out there. Look out for each other. Trust your instincts. And if you know something, say something. You might just change someone's life. Thank you for listening.